Okay. All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is the last session before lunch, and I'm pleased to introduce two very excellent speakers in the area of network engineering and performance measurement. Today we have BRENNA MEADE and Doug Southworth, both from Indiana University and the EPIC project, and they are going to be going over a couple of related topics to build on what we heard about in the last session. In particular, routing anomalies and how we can use tools like perfSONAR and NetSage to try to learn a little bit about how they occur and how we can prevent them in the future. So I will turn it over to BRENNA and Doug to give a little bit of an introduction here, and we'll have time for questions after.
Hi everyone, my name is BRENNA MEADE. I've been a network engineer for almost 10 years now, since I was in college and undergrad. So I'm here to talk to you guys a little bit about BGP, how it works, why it sometimes doesn't work, and what we do as a community to try to fix routes that we determine are anomalous or are doing what we don't expect them to be doing. And then we will talk about how we use perfSONAR to discover these issues and then fix them as we discover them. So thank you. Again, my name is BRENNA, and this is Doug. So to start, we're just going to go over BGP. I know many of you in here have been campus or network engineers for many years, but as the community grows and we get new engineers in the community, some engineers that are young don't know what BGP is or don't have practical knowledge of how to use it and why it's and how to use it and how to be most efficient in your configuration of it. So BGP, Border Gateway Protocol, is the protocol used between routers to exchange information between or inside AS numbers on the internet. BGP makes the internet work and has for 20, 25 years, and in most cases it just works, especially when you're dealing with commodity networks or just home networking. However, it needs to be tuned to have better performance. BGP makes decisions based on paths, network policies, and rule sets. And many of us who work on BGP say, BGP just works until it doesn't. Especially for those working in R&E networking, like many of us here in this room, there is a significant difference between R&E routing architecture and commodity. Research and education networks focus on bandwidth, performance engineering, deterministic behavior, and working as a community for best performance. This is very different than commodity networks. Commodity networks are interested in traffic shaping, DDoS protections, and it's more of an unknown architecture. There isn't a community working to make commodity networks better, whereas in R&E networking, there is a community, and we all have the same goal to provide research and education networks to those all around the United States and in other countries. R&E networks are engineered to support science. Commodity networks are not. So it's incredibly important we as network engineers and those of us configuring BGP understand the path that we think our BGP configurations are taking and actually look at whether or not that's actually happening in the real world. We want to keep our science traffic on R&E networks for the reasons stated above. We are creating these networks for performance engineering. We want science to move as fast as possible so that scientists can do their work most efficiently. So what are the takeaways from this discussion? Routing does not take care of itself. Though we think BGP just works, it often doesn't work the way we think it does. Old routes may not work well with new networks. New networks may come up and the routes are not changed to implement those networks or put the correct traffic on those new links. New routes may not work as planned or may not be doing what you think your BGP configuration is configured to do. So it is important to have monitoring and other tools in order to confirm that the way you think your traffic is going is actually how it's going. So one of the questions that we've been asking at EPIC and at Indiana University is, how do we address routing anomalies as a community? Again, the difference and the cool thing about R&E networks is that we are a community. We have the ability to collaborate and to work with these researchers to effectively to make their data transfers and their work more efficient so that they can do their science without having to worry about the network. So to do this, we created the Routing Working Group, the International Routing Working Group. So In the past, when we saw a routing issue or a bad route, you say to yourself, oh, I think I found a bad route. What do I do to address this? Originally, you would sort of cold call a network engineer from a different institution and say, hey, I think this issue, you're having this issue on this network. And as many of you that are network engineers, nobody as a network engineer wants to hear that their network doesn't work or that there's something wrong with their network. You often get ignored or told, I don't have time for this. So how do we work together to improve that in process? So with the working group, what do we do now? So the routing working group has 170 members on its mailing list. We work on cases as a community. We identify cases initially, so they are submitted via the mailing list or Slack or in these type of conference conversations. Hey, I'm seeing this performance issue. Hey, I'm seeing this routing issue. Hey, what do you guys think about this best practice for BGP? Teams are then selected by the chairs. I am the chair of the routing working group along with Hans Adelman and Warwick Mitchell from RNet. So you submit your cases to the chairs. The chairs determine teams, which are individuals from institutions that may be able to assist in troubleshooting this routing issue or know someone who can point you to the correct person to help you solve that. The case is added to a master case list with open access, so anyone can access this list and see the cases that we've worked on, the notes, the diagrams, etc. Then a folder is created for that specific case, and team members specific to that case are given access to that folder that contains the more intense diagrams and all of the notes that maybe the network engineers want to keep to themselves in terms of privacy, etc. We have monthly meetings, so at each monthly meeting we go over the cases that are open. We talk to the community about what they're seeing, if they have any ideas on how to solve that issue, and we also get updates from the engineers actually working on those cases. We have about 50 people regularly attending this routing working group per month, and it varies based on who has cases open with us and how much time people have to be at the routing working group. So what are the goals of the routing working group? Obviously, we're all engineers, or most of us that are participating in this routing working group, so there's this engineering focused. We want to document possible routes that may be problematic or erroneous. We want to identify teams to address them, teams of engineers, and we want to check in together to work through them. As I said before, what we're trying to do is not only solve some of these problems, but to create a community of trusted associates, trusted engineers that you know you can go to when you have a routing problem or a question, or you want to talk about some best practices or hear about best practices from other networks. We also have a policy focus, so we would like to detail routing policies for specific paths. This includes backup paths, so that we as a community understand what's going on with networks such as AER or CAE or even Internet 2 here in the United States, or what's going on with ESNet. And then we would also like to verify that that policy is being followed through the routing working group. So those are our two goals, engineering and policy focused. So you're sitting here thinking, what kinds of challenges are you looking at through the routing working group? Why do we need this group? Some of the things that we've seen, obviously asymmetric routing, meaning that it goes from one point to one destination one way and back a different way. This often has impacts on performance, especially if one of the routes is hundreds of milliseconds longer than the other route. That has an impact on performance. RNE data taking a less efficient route around the world, also affecting performance. For example, Europe to Asia traffic traversing the US, Africa to Europe traffic traversing the US. RNE data, again, that's taking a commodity route when an RNE path is available. Again, commodity routes are not tuned for research and education performance and often cause a degradation in performance when you end up on a commercial path versus an RNE path. New RNE links that are removed or added or changed, but we don't address the routing effect appropriately. Again, oftentimes when a new link is established, BGP will just work and that link will come up and traffic will be on it, but is it the right traffic? Is it the most efficient traffic? Is it the most efficient route? By adding this new route, have we made a different path more efficient for this data transfer? Leaked private ASNs into the global routing table by RNA networks, and then IP blocks advertised with a bogon origin ASN within RNA networks. So these are just a few of the things we've only been around for about a year, so these are the topics that we've addressed in our year. We have closed a total of 14 cases since our introduction in June 2021. We hope to have a similar number this year, and we hope to have more of you join from the community that may have questions, want to participate in these discussions, or have a routing case that you want to bring to us that you need assistance from the community to address, or you have an interesting case of a routing issue that you addressed already that you would like to share. So we have a number of tools available for this troubleshooting. I use these tools daily as part of the routing working group to troubleshoot or to identify these issues. NetSage, which gives you quick access to flow, SNMP, and route information. For any of you that are staying here this afternoon, there is a workshop, a hands-on workshop with Doug Southworth to talk about NetSage and all the things you can do with it. That's today at 11:30, correct?
1:30.
1:30, sorry. 11:30 already happened. Also trace routes, route views peering, router proxy, and looking glass. These are some of the tools, and perfSONAR. These are some of the tools that we use to address these issues. In this talk today, we're going to focus a little bit on perfSONAR because most of these cases that I will go over, we identified using perfSONAR, and then Doug will talk a little bit more about some interesting cases where perfSONAR helped us troubleshoot a very specific issue. So I'm going to go over 3 cases we've worked on in the routing working group that were solved within the community. So the first one is asymmetric routing that was preventing access to the Starlight ESNet DTN from Indonesia. This was a case of one path was using RNE networks versus via TANE, Transpac, and PacWave. The other route was actually using PCCW and other commercial paths. As many of you know, ESNet DTNs cannot be accessed from commodity networks, so we had to change the peering. We worked with ESNet, who is part of the routing working group. There are a number of engineers from ESNet in the routing working group to prefer Transpac over the commercial routes. So as you see, we have the team here. We worked with engineers from Singeren, ITB, IU, and ESNet to solve this case. The next case was traffic from Singapore to New Zealand that was traversing the US and was also asymmetrical. So if you look down here, the routes before changing the routing were Singeren, Singapore to Singeren LA to Internet to LA to New Zealand. The other way was Singeren to APAN JP, which is Japan, Tokyo, Transpac to New Zealand. Neither of these were using the newly established GOREX link, which is in Guam, the Singapore to Guam link, which is a more efficient path. So we worked with engineers from engineers from New Zealand, Singeren, and Singeren to change the peering so that these 2 links now go, the path that is now using is Singeren to GOREX to New Zealand RANs. We saw a 2 gigabit per second improvement on this link, and we've seen a lot of, this case specifically has gotten a lot of movement from researchers in RANs as they were seeing data transfer performances on issues on this link. Finally, route from Taiwan to Singapore, traversing the US. So internal to Asia, going through the United States, which doesn't make sense. So we established a team, myself, Singeren, and engineers from Taiwan to look at this. As you can see, from Taiwan to Singapore, we have 10 hops going through the United States, Chicago, Kansas, Salt Lake, LA. So traversing the entire United States to stay internal to Asia. So we worked with engineers here to essentially change the left side route to what is the right side route, the Singapore to Taiwan route. So we worked with this team, and now these are the new routes they take. So Taiwan to Tokyo to Singapore, to the Singeren Tokyo exchange, and then into Singapore. So now this route is symmetrical. We also saw a 1 gigabit per second improvement in this data transfer based on reducing the milliseconds that this transfer is taking around the world. In order to see this asymmetrical routing, we used perfSONAR. So we initially identified a possible case in NetSage. Then we drilled down into these cases using perfSONAR trace routes, throughput tests, and other tools of perfSONAR. So we are now going to talk, Doug is now going to talk about perfSONAR, some commands that you can use to help troubleshoot, and some interesting cases that we saw that were improved through the use of perfSONAR to troubleshoot.
Thank you. So here's where we go down the rabbit hole just a little bit deeper. As Brenna said, perfSONAR is a tool that we use on a regular basis for performance analysis. And so some of this is going to be a primer for some of you because you already know how perfSONAR works, but we're going to go through a couple different ideas about commands and syntax and give you an idea of why exactly this is valuable to us. And it's also a bit of a sales pitch for if you don't have a node up and running at your institution, we'd love you to have one because it makes the global R&E community stronger. It makes troubleshooting easier, makes a lot of things just work in terms of being able to find out what's going on in R&E. So a lot of the basically all of the tools that are part of perfSONAR are available kind of one-off. They're open source. What perfSONAR is a collection of these tools, and the secret sauce that makes it all work is pscheduler. A lot of these tools, like if you're doing bandwidth testing with iPerf, that's a client-server setup. So you've got your side that's ready to do a test, but now you've got to call the person on the other side, and you have to have them set up to receive a test, and ports have to be opened. All those things have to happen. There's a lot of coordination that has to happen to make a simple test work. So pscheduler is this engine that drives perfSONAR that takes care of all that on every end. So you've got perfSONAR nodes scattered around the globe at different points of different networks. And what pscheduler does is it makes for a common syntax that wraps all these different tools like traceroute, iPerf, one-way ping, all those types of things together, gives them a common syntax, and it coordinates time slots for testing. Because if you're doing a bandwidth test, you want to make sure that that test is exclusive. You don't want to have that box doing 5 different bandwidth tests at the same time. It also makes sure that access control is maintained, that security is maintained. There's some control and ways to make sure that the kind of testing that's happening is not harmful to your network. So perfSONAR brings that all under one specific umbrella. So the basic syntax is pretty simple. You tell it you want to do pscheduler, you give it a task, and then you give it a test type, and then you give it some options. So there's more than one tool for a lot of these. For instance, if you're going to do multi-stream, you're going to run iPerf2. So if you want to do a multi-stream test, you need to specify that tool. Traceroute or tracepath versus do you want a simple traceroute to get from A to B, or do you want to know the MTUs along the way? There's trade-offs there because tracepath is going to take longer to run. So maybe you don't need the MTU information, so you want to just run a simple traceroute. And as always, -- help is your friend whenever you're looking at any of these tools and you need to know the syntax. So what makes this valuable, though, is the ability to issue remote commands, to be able to use another perfSONAR node as your own node, even if you don't own it. The ability to run tests between 2 nodes that you don't own on your network. So if you've got a perfSONAR box, you can issue commands to a source box and have it run a test to a destination box, neither one of which you have any control over other than just issuing commands from your perfSONAR nodes. So the source and destination flags in a test do exactly what you think they would do, but the source and destination don't even have to be on your network. And that's the core piece of functionality that makes this useful to us when we're doing these type of routing working group explorations or even more in-depth analysis. So just some examples. This is a bit of a eye test. I apologize for that. But I'm running a throughput test we have a node in New York and we have another node in Seattle. And I'm running a throughput test from a node that I have at IU. So I'm not logged into an endpoint here. I'm not logged into my Seattle node or my New York node. I'm just issuing a command from the node I'm running at IU. And honestly, I've got a pretty clean path there. 9.37 is about as good as you can hope for. Same thing, if I'm going to run a trace path between the 2 of them, I can now look at what a trace route looks like with MTU information between those 2 boxes. Again, I don't have to be logged into either one of them. I don't have to set up anything special. pscheduler just makes it work. So built-in diagnostics, there's another one interesting there as well. If you have a perfSONAR node and you issue a pscheduler troubleshoot command, it's going to go through and run a number of tests on your own node just to make sure that everything is ready to go. But you can actually issue that test between your node and a remote node to make sure that they are talking to each other, that the path is clear, that the services that need to be running are running, all of those things. But you can actually, again, use two remote boxes with this -- host option in there. You can say that this remote node is a host for this troubleshooting session, and this other node is the target. And so you can do something like this, again, between my New York and Seattle nodes. And it runs a variety of tests to make sure, again, that the archiver is working, that services are working, that the clocks are synced. Now you know that you can actually complete a successful test between two endpoints before you actually do a production one. And what if a test fails? It says the test didn't start or it wasn't scheduled in time. You can actually even issue a remote command to look at the pscheduler monitor and see what a remote node is doing. How many jobs does it have? If they're coming up failed, you'll see a red line in there that'll tell you that a test has failed or a specific task has failed because there wasn't enough, say, time in the schedule. Remember, pscheduler is scheduling exclusive slots for tests that need that exclusive slot. And so you can actually overload a node. You can put too much on it where it doesn't have enough free time to actually do all the testing. This would allow you to see that. So how does that work in the wild? We've got an example here, and if you're looking for something to keep you awake during the presentation, you can start counting how many times I mix up letters in NRAO and SARAO because I'm going to transpose those at some point. So kind of a fun game for you while we're doing this rest of this presentation. So we got a call basically from the NRAO saying that, which is basically hanging off the side of the UVA campus, saying that we're getting really, really poor performance down to Cape Town to the SARAO. And it genuinely was bad. It was on the order of a handful of megabits a second. And so we started doing some initial testing using perfSONAR. And the first thing we're going to look at, of course, is routing. What does it look like, a path between the two? Now, fortunately, NRAO actually has a perfSONAR node right there in their network. So we're getting really close to the source. And the SARAO actually has a node that is not right at the endpoint, but basically it's at a supercomputing center that the SARAO hangs off of. So we know we're reasonably close to an endpoint there, and the routing should be useful. So we did some trace routes. We used the remote boxes to do that, and we did find asymmetric routing. It was taking one particular path, was going all the way up through Africa and into Europe and then back across the North Atlantic and over to Virginia. And the path the other direction was going across the link from Cape Town to South America and then coming up through Miami and ending up in Virginia, which is actually a shorter, more efficient route, but we did have kind of that asymmetric routing going on. We figured that out pretty quickly. We got in touch with engineers, routes were corrected, and it didn't change performance. So I'm going to ruin the rest of the presentation right there by telling you this was not strictly a routing problem. There was a routing issue. It should have been made symmetrical, and we did that. However, it didn't completely fix the performance problem we were seeing. So now's where we kind of dive in even deeper. So we wanted to start looking for possible perfSONAR installations along the path that we were interested in looking at. And so this is kind of a brief list of what we came up with. There's going to be a quiz later, so make sure you write these down because I will be asking questions. But the ones primarily we're interested in are the NRAO, and more interestingly, there's one on the NRAO side of UVA's campus, and then UVA actually maintains one as well. And so you've got that split campus, that split network that kind of joins at one point, and that becomes an interesting piece of information for this particular case. So we've got there's one up in Washington, Atlanta, Ashburn, so just kind of scattered around the map there. You can see we've got a couple from the northerly route, and then we've got a couple from the southerly route because we want to be able to look at the way the traffic was flowing both directions. So to find those, we just use the perfSONAR lookup service directory. If you're not familiar with this, it's a listing of publicly available perfSONAR nodes that you can test to right now. And you can look for these by almost any criteria. You can throw in a city name, you can throw in a partial IP address, you can throw in a part of a FQDN, maybe just a city, maybe even just a country, and it will start to narrow down those results for you, and hopefully you can find something that's close to an endpoint that you're looking to test against. The only caveat to this is this only shows nodes that have some sort of commercial route as well, because this instance is an AWS instance, so there has to be a commercial path for the perfSONAR node to talk out and say, hey, here's my information. So there actually are more perfSONAR nodes in the wild than what you would see in the lookup service directory. So if I can't find one, sometimes I'll actually drop an email to an institution and say, hey, do you have a node that's not listed because it's only on RNE, just a curiosity. So we start looking initial problem isolation. We do a couple bandwidth tests from South Africa to Internet 2 in Washington and in Albany, and we're getting really solid bandwidth numbers. Nothing near as bad as what the transfer for performance looked like to NRAO. So we decided to go from Washington, where we had good performance from South Africa up to Washington. We go to Washington to NRAO, and the performance is good, but remember, we're only milliseconds away now, so the performance is going to look relatively good no matter how bad things are. But we do see a lot of retries. There's a lot of retries. Same thing, the HPC center at UVA, which is on the other side of the campus network, to Washington is same thing, decent bandwidth, lots of retries. And even NRAO to the HPC center just across campus, again, great bandwidth because they're milliseconds apart, like 5 milliseconds, but there's tons of retries. So based on this, we know we've got a problem somewhere in that UVA network. So we go to campus engineers, say, just give us a block diagram. What are we dealing with here? And this is what they gave us. We know from UVA that their network is 1500. They had no interest in being a large block 9000 MTU network. So somewhere they're doing a step down. Oops. They're doing a step down somewhere. Is it here? Is it here? Is it here? We don't know yet. We're trying to figure that part out. NRAO is 9000 though. We know that for a fact, that their network is MTU 9000. So now we've got a bit of a mystery to figure out where exactly the step down and or step back up consequently is actually happening. So we're going to take a little side trip over to path MTU discovery. You don't have to have a 9000 MTU path the whole way to have decent performance. It's preferred, especially if you're doing large transfers. But if path MTU discovery is in place and working, everything should come out fine. They'll renegotiate down from 9,000 to say 1,500 or whatever the agreed upon MTU is, and everything will start working. But it's a layer 3 construct, and it requires UDP and ICMP to function. And what's one thing a lot of networks like to block? ICMP. So we need those open in RNE if this is going to work, if we have any chance of having reasonable performance when we don't know the MTU end to end. So it's not the end of the world if we don't have that big, huge, fat MTU path end to end, but we do need to be able to have certain ports open, and packets can be fragmented down to smaller MTUs. You're going to lose some performance, but at least it'll work. But in this case, something was amiss, and we were trying to figure out where exactly that problem was because we were dropping a lot of traffic. So working inward from ESNet to a known good ESNet node, which means any of them because they're all very well maintained, we work inwards towards UVA, and this is what we see. We've got two hosts that, even though the ESNet network is running at an MTU of 9,000, they successfully negotiate an MTU of 1,500, and we've got really good bandwidth with just a few retransmits, but that's typical of kind of that initial ramp up when they hit each other. They have to kind of stabilize for a second. So everything looks really, really solid. We're getting 9+ gigs of throughput on a 10 gig link. So where it doesn't look so good is when we're working from that same ESNet host into NRAO. So the first part there is actually no traffic whatsoever because the 9,000 byte packets are failing. And then perfSONAR is actually smart enough to start going in halves and saying, okay, well that didn't work, let's try 4,500. Okay, well that didn't work, let's try 2,250. So perfSONAR is an intelligent enough tool to do a negotiation if path MTU discovery is not working. So eventually they figure out a packet size that works for both ends, and you can see the throughput starts to climb, and if we let this go longer, it might have gotten better over time. But generally, things are really looking terrible there in terms of such a short distance transfer. So now we're curious what a trace route from ESNet to NRAO looks like. And again, we're issuing all these commands remotely, right? None of us is logged into ESNet's boxes or NRAO's perfSONAR nodes. These are all being issued as remote commands that we talked about earlier. And so the highlighted hop there, that is the handoff from Maria, which is their regional, to UVA. So hop number 8 is the last stop for Maria, and then you jump into UVA's network at hop 9. So everything looks good. We have a trace path that goes through. It's only 10 milliseconds. Everything looks fine. Or a trace route, I should say. But if we do a trace path, it fails, which was kind of a clue. And actually, this taught me something about the 2 different protocols there, because I couldn't figure out initially why that was failing. And Jason and I and a couple other people that were involved in this got to learn a little bit about protocols here. So same hop, that 8 to 9, that Maria to UVA handoff now doesn't work. We're losing packets, no reply. So it turns out they use drastically different sized packets. So traceroute will make it through almost anything because it's 60 bytes. It's under the cap of almost anything out there on the network. Tracepath is using much, much larger 64K packets by default. So we've got a roadblock somewhere where small packets can make it through, large packets can't. So just for curiosity, we wanted to know what that number was, so we started using tracepath still. We started specifying smaller and smaller packets, just cutting 9,000 in half to 4,500 to 20, just keep cutting it in half until something goes through. So where we ended up with was at 1509, we still had no reply. At 1508, everything makes it through. So now we know we've got some sort of MTU breakdown between Maria and UVA, or at least we're thinking maybe that's where it is. But obviously between hops 8 and 9, things start to not work so hot. So again, we call up our engineers, and now instead of just saying, hey, we've got a problem, we need you to investigate and fix it, what we have for them is information that says somewhere in the handoff here between these 2 hops, we've got an MTU mismatch, and we need you to look at that. And if you give somebody a wide-scale problem and just say, hey, there's a problem, could you fix it? The uptake rate on that kind of invitation to fix a problem is usually very low because they have other things to do. If you can go through and do some problem isolation like this and say, look, we think we already know what it is, could you just check on this for us? It's much less of their time, and you're much more likely to get some uptake on the issue. And so it turns out the Maria interface is at 9192, the UVA interface is at 1518, because remember, they just want to run a 1500 byte network. So they broke path MTU discovery by doing that, and now packets above a certain size were not able to make it through the network unless you had a transfer tool that was intelligent enough to figure that out on its own. So at the end of the day, we've got a couple ping verifications. Engineers went ahead and corrected that. They made the interfaces match at 9192. So UVA and Maria are now at the same MTU. And then on the other side of that routed hop, they can now step down to 1500. There's nothing stopping you from changing MTU over a routed hop like that, but you can't just have a mismatched interface, which I know you all know. So we do some ping verifications, and it starts behaving exactly like we'd expect it to. So if we don't allow the packet to fragment, we start getting a message back. The message too long, the MTU is only 1500. That's where we need that ICMP to be able to communicate back and forth and give us those reply messages that say, that MTU is not going to work, we need to be down and lower at 1500. And if we do allow the packets to fragment, all of a sudden they're making it through like we'd expect, and again about that same 10 millisecond time. Whew. So after all of that, what's the performance look like? Well, our initial 10-second test, we got a looks like a balmy 380 kilobits per second across a 10-second initial test, running a slightly longer 30-second test after we had fixed it to give TCP time to ramp. Without any additional tuning, we're now up 2.5, getting close to 3 gigs of throughput a second across that exact same path. And from here on, you could do some additional tuning and some additional pathing and really tweak that number if you wanted to. But we've taken it from a useless link to a useful link, and that was really the goal of this entire operation. I've got one more example here that I'm just going to step through really quickly. Basically, it was a tunnel that we had, a GRE tunnel between the City College of New York and Kyotech Institute over in Japan. And they were getting radically asymmetrical performance. They were only getting 80 megabit one direction, but we talked to them and they said, well, that's actually all we're expecting out of this particular GRE path. But coming back the other way, they're getting 8 megabit. And it's really low packet loss, but again, this is now a 230 millisecond hop, so a little bit of packet loss goes a long way in killing performance. So we did the same kind of steps we just talked about. We used perfSONAR nodes along the known path to establish what the routes were, and it turns out the route was symmetric. It was a GRE tunnel, so it would have been pretty hard for it to not be. But we were able to identify perfSONAR nodes along the path to run tests to. And basically all the external testing in Chicago, in Seattle, in APAN, all the external testing we did said that the performance was fine and we couldn't find any specific issue. So now we're back to CCNY's campus, and we actually asked them to put a perfSONAR node in the lab. Hey, we're trying to troubleshoot this for you. Could you give us a hand up and just put a node actually right at the source of where you're trying to do your transfers from? And so by involving some other engineers from NYSERNet, we did limit it to their campus. In fact, we were able to narrow it down to a specific segment of their campus and say it's somewhere right in this little spot right here. We're losing packets and we can't figure out why. Well, it turns out CCNY engineers started poking around and they find an old outdated security device that had been slated for replacement, and it just hadn't happened yet. So they bumped up their timetable a little bit. They replaced this old network security device, and lo and behold, our packet loss disappears. And now we have symmetrical 80 to 85 megabit performance along the entire path. So I know that a lot of these didn't really center around specific routing fixes. The first example did show some asymmetric routing. The second one actually was just a route confirmation that everything was behaving like we expected it to. But it is examples of how these remote commands and these remote perfSONAR nodes are useful for having endpoints on either side that you can verify how traffic is flowing. You can run performance tests. You can see when you actually are able to make changes if those changes were fruitful, if they helped at all. And so that's really part of what we're looking at here is, again, it's a sales pitch. As we're doing this routing working group type of activities, and as we're doing these performance analysis activities, we need perfSONAR nodes out in the wild, especially at large, well-equipped institutions. It gives us the ability to have endpoints at various points in the R&E network so that we know where things are coming from. And it also allows us to stop bugging you guys as much, because if we can run the tests we need to run to verify performance and make sure researchers are happy, we're not calling you up, knocking down your door, saying, hey, you've got a problem, and just go find it. We're willing to do some of the legwork here, but perfSONAR is one of those tools that if we can have it on your network somewhere is extremely valuable to us. And I think that you've got one more thing. All right.
Could you put those slides back up real quickly? Can you go to the end by chance? The second to last? Oh, I can do it from here. That works.
There we go.
Okay, so the overarching goal, right, of this conversation is to try to get us to think about being more proactive as network engineers, not waiting for that problem to be discovered, but to create a community and have these perfSONAR nodes out there, so that we as a community can be proactive and work with each other on solving these problems with perfSONAR, with NetSage, with the relationships that we develop by being part of the group. Instead of just reacting to things that are going wrong or reacting to that researcher coming to you and telling you that his data transfer performance is degraded and what's going on with your network, I'm just going to use my hotspot. And so the goal of the routing working group is to create that collaborative group and give you people to trust, to talk to, and to work through these problems with, or even just come to the group with said problem, and maybe someone else has experienced it, or they know of an engineer that can help you. So if you are interested in joining the routing working group, here is our contact information. That's my email there. We have a mailing list, a Slack channel, and a website. We meet once a month. We will not be meeting in October because of supercomputing, because I am the supercomputing WAN lead and will not have time. But we will be meeting in November at supercomputing if any of you are there and want to come and listen to us. Take my information down. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. We'll be here for questions, and we'll be here this afternoon. So thank you all.